For this mock exercise, we're going to take a look at this case called Waterbury Inc. And we're going to look at pricing decisions, product profitability, and cost management. So let's take a look. Waterbury manufactures and sells RF-17s, a specialty raft used for whitewater rafting. In 2013, it reported the following. So 2013, they sold 20,000 units. The investment in producing this specialty raft was $2.4 million. The full cost is $300 per unit. The rate of return on investment is 20%. And the markup percentage on variable cost is 50%. So the first part is asking us, what was the selling price in 2013? So they want us to calculate the revenue the revenue per unit. And what was the percentage of markup on full cost? What was the variable cost per unit? Okay, so this allows us actually to work backwards. So this question allows us to look at the relationship between revenue, variable cost, and operating profit. It allows us to also look at the relationship between return on investment and percentage markup on variable cost. Let's take a look. So for the first part, we know that we are given the investment. That investment was $2.4 million. And we're also given the ROI. And if you remember, the ROI calculation was operating income divided by investment. This was one of your performance measurement. So we know that the ROR is 20%. That was given to us. So by doing the formula, multiply 20 times 2.4 to give us operating income of 480. So that is 20% times 2,400,000. Now, how many units did we actually sold? Number of units sold given to us was 20,000 units. So the operating income per unit is 480 divided by 20,000 gives me $24 per unit. Now, we're told that the full cost is 300. If I know the full cost is 300 and that's the operating profit, then the revenue must be 300 plus 24 is $324 per unit. So that is one of the required. We're asked to actually calculate the revenue per unit. Now, what's the markup? The markup percentage on full cost. That's what it's asking us, right? No, actually, it's asking for variable cost. But we do need to know the markup on full cost. And how do we calculate that? The markup on full cost is going to be $24, which is the operating profit, divided by the cost, which is 300, and that gives us 8%. So that was the other. There was the other question. The markup on full cost is 8%. This is the revenue. So I put a little check mark based on the required. Let me highlight that actually, so that we could see that this is one of the requireds. Now the third one is asking us for variable cost markup. So sales price. So what else are we given? We're given the markup on variable cost, aren't we? So selling price minus variable cost, the selling price equals variable cost times, remember it's a 50% markup, so times 1.50. So we know what the selling price is $324 equals variable cost times 1.50. So variable cost is 324 divided by 1.5 gives me 216. So remember, the required says, what is the variable cost per unit? And we just calculated that to 216. Okay? So the first part is we need to know the relationship. We know that the return on equity is, the formula is operating income divided by investment, because that was given to us, investment was given to us, this must be the operating income. Then we unitize that operating income to be 24. We add the full cost to give us the revenue per unit, that's 324. That was one of the required. Then they asked us to calculate the markup on full cost. And how do we calculate that? We take a look at the operating income divided by the cost. So we mark up 8%. That means that the revenue is 8% above the cost. Now, once we know the actual revenue, we know that the selling price, and we're given the fact that the variable cost percentage of, as a percentage, the markup percentage of variable cost is 50%. We know that variable is, selling price is 50% higher, or plus 50% of variable cost. So that's why you have this relationship. We know the selling price from this calculation times divided by 1.5 gives us 216. Okay. Now, let's look at the second part of the required. It says that Waterbury is considering raising its selling price to $348. However, at this price, its sales volume is predicted to fall by 10%. So we know that if the selling price in our first calculation is $324, if we're going to increase it to $348, we know that the number of units falls by 10%. If Waterbury's cost structure, in other words, the variable cost for fixed per unit and total fixed cost, remains unchanged, and if demand of forecast is accurate, should it raise its price to $348? Okay, so they're asking us to look at the profitability if the price is higher. Okay, so how did we do that? Well, we need to figure out the total fixed cost. Now, what was the total cost? We're told the total cost is 300 minus variable cost. And we just calculated the variable cost, didn't we, as 216 in the previous question. So fixed cost is $84 per unit. Now, multiply by how many units did we sold? We sold 20,000 units to give us total fixed cost of $1,680,000. Now, at a price, at selling price of $348, which is much higher, we know that we're going to sell 20,000 units times 90%, because we're told that the sales, the number of volume is going to go down by 10%. So that gives me 6,264,000. Now, this, I just wanted to show you, this calculation is actually 18,000 units. Okay? That's 624. Now, variable cost, we know the variable cost, we calculate is 216 times 18,000 units. Contribution margin is 2376, which is the same as 348 less 216 gives you 132 times 18,000 units. Okay, so that's the same as what we just did. I just showed you the long way and I'll show you the shortcut way. Fixed cost is what we just calculated, 1.680. So let me just put a little arrow beside it. And that gives us a operating income of 696. Now, this number is higher, right? So at selling price of 348, our operating income is 696. At selling price of 324, our operating income from part 1 is 480. All right, remember this one, 480? So that's 480. So what's the difference here? So clearly, it's better, isn't it? So it's better. So it's better to increase, assuming everything is accurate, it's better to increase the selling price and reduce the number of quantities sold, because it's going to generate an overall profit of much higher, 696 versus 480. Now, we're going to assume that everything is accurate, right? We're going to assume that all of this is the data given to us is accurate. So the answer is it better? The answer is yes. So yes, should increase sales price to 348. Okay, so let's look at part 3 of the question. Part 3 says, in 2014, due to increase in competition, Waterbury must reduce its selling price to $3.15. So now we're going down in order to sell 20,000 units. The manager of the raft division reduced its annual investment to 2.1, but still demands a 20% return on investment. If fixed costs cannot be changed within this time frame, what is the targeted, so that's the question, variable overhead cost per unit? Okay, so let's solve this problem. So for part 3, the target investment in 2014 is $2.1 million. And the targeted ROI is 20%. So we know that the targeted operating income is 2100 times 20% gives me 420,000. Now, what's the revenue levels? The revenue is going to be 315 times 20,000 units. Less operating income of 420. This gives me a total cost. Now, what was the fixed cost? Remember the fixed cost that we calculated in part I think it was in part 2, wasn't it? We calculated fixed cost to be 1.680. Variable cost must be 4200. So the target variable cost is 4200 divided by 20,000 units. So management would have to figure out a way to decrease their variable cost. Now remember, what was the variable cost in part 1? If you remember, the variable cost in part 1 was 216, right? So the variable cost in part 1 was 216. And so this is like 2013. And 2014, because of competition, our variable cost is now 210. So management will have to figure out a way to cut variable costs to $6. Now, there's a couple of learning objectives in this question that I wanted to show you. And I waited until the end of doing this question to show you. So in this chapter, we talked about different ways to develop pricing and develop target price and target cost. So we know that there are essentially the main 5 steps in developing the target price and the target cost. So the first part is we've got to figure out a product that's going to satisfy the demand and needs of potential customers. Then 2 says we need to choose a target price and target operating income. And that's based on a combination of corporate culture, or perhaps the target price could be what the competitors currently are selling it for. And you don't want to be pricing too low or too high. You want to be priced somewhere around the competitors. Or you might want to look at perhaps a target operating income per unit based on shareholders or stakeholders' return on investment. In other cases, we're going to have to drive the target cost per unit. So target cost per unit is going to be the price that market is willing to bear, less the operating profit that shareholders or stakeholders are willing to accept, and that difference will be the target cost. And this is important because the target cost is what's going to dictate how we figure out in our value chain which element of activities that we are going to provide or perform in the value chain. It's going to try to add value to this particular product at the lowest cost. And you'll see that that was part 3 of the question, wasn't it? Was we knew what the target income was going to be. We knew what the target price was going to be in part 3. And now we're left with having to produce this at $210 per unit of variable cost. And we have to figure out ways to reduce costs to achieve that $210. So figure out a way to help us reduce $6 of variable cost. That's the steps. Now, there's another way called cost-based or cost-plus pricing. And that's what we saw in one of the parts of the question for electron. And here it says, what price would we charge to cover our costs and earn a profit? So profit margin and long-run pricing are set to earn a reasonable return on investment. Price charge is based on what it costs us to produce, coupled with the ability to recoup the cost and still achieve a required rate of return. So the formula is normally a markup component to cost. So we saw that in part 1 to this question. Part 1 of the question said the revenue was $324, our full cost was $300, so the markup was 8%. So this is a bit of a different way of pricing. It's saying a cost-plus approach. And usually, as a starting point, we use this method as a starting point for pricing. So sometimes we do this, and then we realize that the price that we're charging which is, in this case, $324, our competitor is selling for $290. So this is while we figure out whether we can do this product or not, whether it's attractive enough for us to enter into the new market. Markup is somewhat flexible based partially on customer and competitors' demand. And sometimes when we do cost plus, we have a different definition of cost. Sometimes cost could be variable cost, manufacturing. Sometimes it could be full cost or different definitions. So again, depending on how we define cost will dictate what the markup is. So I've given you some examples in this. So cost plus pricing begins with some sort of cost to produce a product, and then we add on an appropriate markup to determine the revenue. So I've given you some examples here. So, and finally, one approach for cost plus with target rate of return on investment is to start with the invested capital, much like we did in this question, the electron question. We multiply by a targeted rate of return on investment to give us our operating profit. Then we divide that by an expected sales to give us the profit per sale, per unit. Then we add that to the cost to determine the selling price. So sometimes we would price it based on, so if we're the only one in the marketplace, so what we do is we establish our cost plus our operating profit target based on some expected return on investment by stakeholders to determine the selling price. So if we're the market drivers, this is how we determine the selling price. If we're one of these price takers where there's already competitors in the marketplace, oftentimes we determine the market price. It's normally set by the market. We subtract the rate of return, the operating income based on some sort of rate of return, and that difference is going to be our targeted cost. And we're going to try to figure out a way to rationalize our cost structure to meet that level of unit cost. Okay? So I like this question because it gave us different aspects of pricing based on different assumptions. Thank you.